regardless.
Okay, so thank you all for coming today, whether you're here in person or you're out in the internet. You guys are not seeing double. This is my brother, John, and I'm going to give him a brief introduction, and he'll add to that a little bit as he goes on, as it's relevant. So John is with us today. He's a city planner and an environmental consultant in California, in Central Coast of California, and he's an expert, I think I can say, on water issues in the upper and lower Colorado River Basin. And he's very plugged into the emerging political environment that's involved with managing that resource. And he's going to tell you a lot about it. And so without further ado, let me just sort of set the ground rules really quick. We'll save questions till the end, and we're going to make sure to reserve questions. He'll probably go about 45 minutes or so. And after we are done, we want to invite everybody to Pitt Street to join us for a beer and to go on and keep talking about the Colorado River and whatever else. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to you.
But you do have to stay the whole time or no beer. That's the deal. That's the deal.
That sounds fair.
So first of all, thank you. Thanks to Tom. Thanks to Rosanna. Thanks to all of you guys. I'm not normally here, so it's nice to be here on the East Coast where the air is, it's breathable. It's nice.
No fire.
No fire. No, actually, there's no fire in California right now, or not where we're at. Okay, I'm going to do this so it's a little easier to see. Just a little background about me. It's really good to be talking in front of this department because my background, I could have been in this department. I got my BS in geography from UC Davis. I got a master's in city and regional planning from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I've been in the environmental consulting field for about 30 years. So I've been a consultant the whole time. I haven't been in academia. I've worked in the public sector. So I'm missing certain perspectives, although I work with all those people all the time. So I come at it from a certain perspective. And as a secondary purpose of this here, this discussion, anybody who's interested in knowing more about what it is to be a consultant, the pros, the cons, the ups, the downs, how you get a job, who you need to know, who you need to talk to, who you need to pay off, whatever it might be, that is something I could help you with or answer questions about. So I'd be glad to do that. What we're going to talk about today is a major issue in the West in the United States, and that's water issues. It's always been an issue, but in the world of climate change and expanding growth in the West, it's taken on extra meaning. There are definite truths. There's some myths about what people encounter, and I want to go through those, but I kind of want to talk about what the issues are right now on the Colorado River, what's being done about it, and maybe propose some solutions about what could be done to make the West livable in a sustainable way. I want to talk about this also through the lens of my own experience. I've been going to different places in the Southwest for years. I love the area. I go to Lake Powell, which is a place I want to talk about quite a bit, for the last 35 years. I'd tell you that origin story, but it would take too long. But if over a beer you want to ask me about it, I'm glad to tell you about it. I am Tom's older brother. That's always been true. It will continue to be true. So for what it's worth, I've got him by a year and a half. It's never going to change. So let's talk about the crux of the discussion, the challenge in front of us. First of all, how many of you have been to Grand Canyon, Colorado River, Lake Powell, Lake Mead? So some of you are familiar with it, and it's probably, at least academically, you probably know a lot about it. What you've got there is a watershed that is important to 40 million people in 7 states for a lot of reasons: water supply, power, recreation, flood control. It's been around those 2 reservoirs for decades. I'll explain their origin in a bit. All this is filtered through the lens of the legal framework, which is collectively called the law of the river. It's not one law. It's not 3 laws. It's dozens of documents spanning back 100 years that govern how water is distributed, used in the Colorado system. It's unwieldy, it's sort of unworkable, and it's going to be updated in the next 4 or 5 years. That's the exciting part. There's some opportunity here. We'll go over a little bit of that. The problem with that legal framework is the assumptions it was based on, mostly in terms of water supply, snowpack, river flow, may have been somewhat accurate in 1922 when it was first put together, but is not accurate today. It's not workable. It's a game of musical chairs. There's not enough chairs. There's not enough water for the people who use it. So the bottom line question is how can we reimagine this, reframe this for the future? This slide is mostly a nice picture, and this is actually courtesy of the Bureau of Reclamation from about a month ago. The basic issue here that you're looking at, everything's red in the west, that's drought. This is just a picture you all know about in terms of climate change. And all those buckets represent some of the major reservoirs in the west. And any red line you see is the average fill of those reservoirs. And you'll see most of those reservoirs are way below average. And of course, that's what we're talking about here. This is as of a month ago. So I attended a seminar with the Bureau, explained all that. So I want to focus on the Colorado River watershed. It serves 7 states. It covers parts of 7 states, centered on Arizona, but important to all 7: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming. And it covers a watershed almost exactly the same size as the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. The difference, it has 5% of the flow of the Columbia River collectively in the watershed. And it's serving roughly 40 million people, which is more than the Columbia River serves. So it's an entirely different system. So that's the problem here. Just very briefly, it's an area that's not well populated. It flows through the desert. Ancestral Pueblans first, they lived in the area 1,000 years ago. They abandoned the area. Why? Climate changed. They left for water and it wasn't there. The Spanish came in and explored on the periphery. They didn't really do anything with the area. Later on, trappers would come in and leave their mark and go away. And there really was not much known in the area for centuries. The Mormons were probably the most ambitious. They actually would cut across the desert, making settlements in the area. But again, small settlements, and really not much was known in this entire region. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that the Colorado River was first run systematically and for the purpose of documenting it scientifically. John Wesley Powell, there's another guy, Jack Sumner, who should get some credit and never does, and a group of 10 guys who went down the river in 1869. The purpose there was both to explore, it was also self-promotion, it was also to see what could be done. And Powell ultimately came to the conclusion there's not a whole lot of water here, and any water that's being used is going to have to be moved around, reclaimed, if land was going to be used, because there's actually quite a bit of fertile soil in the West, and agriculture and its future exploitation was in the cards, as were other issues like gold mining and railroad expansion. All these things were thought about from the lens of people from the East, where it's easy to get around, where the terrain's not an issue, where water's not an issue. Nobody knew the West, and when you applied Eastern principles to the West, it didn't work. By 1900 or so, the idea was, well, let's figure out what we can do with the West. And at that time, the Reclamation Service literally is what it means, reclaiming land for the purpose of using it by moving water around. And that means dams and canals. That came into being in 1902. It became the Bureau of Reclamation, which is a major federal agency that really controls much of the water in the West. And they were in full swing by the 1920s trying to figure out, okay, what do we do with the Colorado River watershed in terms of building dams? So that's where we are in the 1920s with the idea that there's this resource, how do we make it work? Well, this is where I want to talk about the law of the river. In 1922, there was a compact, a law, an agreement signed between 7 states. Those states I said, and remember them because you're going to be tested on them. The lower basin states, California, Nevada, Arizona. The upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Utah. And the importance of that is none of those states would agree on how to split the water. The reason why there was but ultimately they did come to an agreement on how to do this. And you can see from the bottom of this slide, there have been subsequent agreements over the years that codified pieces that were not originally worked out in 1922. The only thing worked out in 1922 was essentially to split the watershed in half. It was assumed there were 15 million acre feet. 1 acre foot is about a football field, a foot deep, and it's enough to supply 3 houses for a year, 2 to 3. And they decided to split it in half. Why did they do that? I'll explain that here in a minute. They split it in half because they couldn't agree on anything other than a basic framework for that. And by splitting it in half, the lower basin would get half of it, the upper basin would get half of it. And there are subtleties to that, but the most important one is that the lower basin legally has the right to get their half before the upper basin does. Seems backwards because water flows from the top and goes to the bottom. And the reason for that is something I won't go into a lot of detail, but there was a court case in 1922, right around that time, that between Wyoming and Colorado. Wyoming sued Colorado, or Colorado sued Wyoming. Wyoming won. The idea was Wyoming was appropriating water from the Cache de la Poudre, one of your old haunts in northern Colorado, to go into Wyoming. In other words, moving water out of the state to another state. And the court sided with Wyoming that that was okay to do. And by doing that, it freaked out Colorado because it meant we could lose our water. And when they thought ahead and applied that principle to the Colorado River, which begins in Colorado, and realized we could lose our water to any downstream state who takes it before we do. And they're thinking California, because even in 1920, California had a lot of agriculture and was siphoning off a lot of water then. They said, we got to get into an agreement where we get our share now. And so they hastily all came together. Colorado brought them all together, and they came to an agreement. And California knew it was holding the cards. And so the agreement basically said, sure, we'll split it, but we get our share before anybody else. And they sort of, Colorado thought any agreement's better than none. So that framework would haunt all the states for 100 years, still does. Here's one of the reasons why. This is an actual chart from the Bureau of Reclamation in a 1950 document that showed the flow of the river back to 1906 to 1947. Doesn't really matter about the numbers here, but what you can see if you just follow your eyes, the line goes downward over time. When the compact was done in 1922, it's about halfway down this chart, it was reasonable to expect 15 to 17, maybe 20 million acre feet per year. As time went on, that skewed downward to 10 to 15 million acre feet. Their agreement between the upper and lower basin was to split 15 million acre feet. Well, if you have 10, how do you do that? That's the situation we face today, only more acutely. This map I just wanted to put in for a second. I collect old National Geographics. I go get them online and I find them all the way back to 1888, whenever they started. And I found this cool old map of the Southwest from a 1940 National Geographic. This is a small piece of it of southeastern Utah. And if you're in southeastern Utah today, you can see this line here, and I'm going to use the little red thing because I can. This is the Colorado River coming up through here. This is San Juan, and here's the Escalante, Green River. Those are major rivers, or were back then in 1940. Today, Lake Powell covers most of this right here. I'll explain that in a bit. So what is true in 1940 is that you had no roads that went across here. You had no city of Page, Arizona, which is a major tourist hub down there today. You had no lake. You had no access to an area that was maybe 250 miles wide by 250 miles high, meaning anything that was going to happen in that area didn't have the benefit of anybody looking out for that resource. And so ultimately, when the area became fodder for possible reservoir use, there was nobody one way or another to say anything. So public input at that time was pretty much non-existent, and in this case wasn't necessary. You had a corner of a state that was essentially unknown. And that concept led to the rise of a couple of big dams in the West. Now, one thing that's important to realize is that the Colorado River system is the most heavily regulated river system in the world. I don't know how many reservoirs are on it exactly. There's big ones and small ones, but I want to focus on the two biggest ones, which were created by Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam. I'll show you where those are in a minute. But Hoover Dam created Lake Mead. Glen Canyon Dam created Lake Powell. Hoover Dam is in the lower basin portion of the Colorado River. Glen Canyon Dam is at the foot of the upper basin. As a concept, the idea was the upper basin was going to be regulated by Glen Canyon Dam, the lower basin by Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam came first, was authorized in 1928 and finished in 1935, and that Lake Mead filled a few years later. Glen Canyon Dam was authorized in the 1950s, built in the early 1960s, filled in 1980, took 17 years to fill. That's how big it is. These are the two largest reservoirs in the United States by volume. They're almost exactly the same size in terms of capacity. Collectively, they can hold 50 million acre feet. 50 million acre feet. That's a lot of water. That is essentially 4 years of flow of the Colorado River in a good year. It's significant. Lake Powell is 180 miles long when it's full. Now, I say when full. These reservoirs are not full today. Oh, this is a quick digression. This is just a quick, I found this old photo. This is a rural road out in the middle of nowhere. It used to be you could river run down the Colorado River before Lake Powell was there. They had to put a sign up there saying, you can't go any farther or else you're going to hit the lake. Don't do that. That's a 1963 photo. This dirt road, by the way, is now a major highway called Utah Highway 95, which cuts across southern Utah. This is the location of the two dams. So you have the upper basin with Glen Canyon Dam at the foot. You have the lower basin with Hoover Dam somewhat in the middle. That's a significant thing to consider. And then right between them, the Grand Canyon right in there. So water flows from Colorado down by the Green River, the Colorado River, the San Juan River, and a few other systems, ends up down here. So most of the water flow gets to this point of the Colorado River. There's not a lot of input beyond that. There's a couple of smaller inputs, but at that point, it's all been collected. That's why Glen Canyon Dam is where it is. It's an impoundment. It's an ideal impoundment area. So, so here we go. This is a diagram. This is an important diagram right here. The schematic of what you just saw. Here's the upper basin. Here's Lake Powell. Here's Lake Mead in the lower basin. What's important about this, think of those two as banks, water banks, literally like a bank you take water in and out of. Now, the upper basin here takes their water. Anybody who's using water from the upper basin, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, is taking their water before it gets to the major reservoirs. That means if the idea is, if they are required to deliver the lower basin's half, which is 7.5 million acre feet of water, it's not easy to know how much water is actually available to do that if they take their water first. But they take their water, the rest of the water flows into Lake Powell, and then through this dam, a certain amount of water is released to go through the Grand Canyon and then to Lake Mead, where it is then distributed to the lower basin states. And you'll notice the lower basin states have specific shares of water, 4.4 million acre feet, 2.8 million acre feet for Arizona, 0.3 for Nevada. The upper basin's all about percentages because their share is not guaranteed. Think of it this way. The lower basin gets its half and the upper basin gets the leftovers. And if the leftovers are 7.5 million acre feet, great. If it's 1 million acre feet, you run a deficit. And that's what's basically been happening in recent decades. I'll show that in a minute. Now, I'll talk about water use in a minute, but that's the dynamic. You've got inputs and outputs this way. I just want to show a couple of slides of what Lake Powell looks like. This is a place called Grotto Canyon. This is a trip from 3 or 4 years ago. This is about halfway up Lake Powell. This is at a time when the lake was about 100 feet below full. I'm going to use the number full pool. I'll explain that in a minute. But I'm going to use numbers like 3,700, 3,600. I mean feet above sea level by that. When Lake Powell is full, it's at 3,700 feet above sea level. This is 100 feet below that. The white line you see here is essentially 100 feet, and if it were full, it would be up to there. Today, the lake is 70 feet lower than that. So these boats you see right here, they'd be high and dry. The lake would be receded somewhat. Here's another great shot. This one is a shot in a side canyon of Lake Powell called Davis Gulch. And this just illustrates how pretty the lake really is. And some of the things you can see in the side canyons. One of the great, to me, attractions of being there. You get to see things like this. This is Lake Mead. By contrast, not quite as scenic. It's out in the desert, in the Nevada desert. You don't see the same side canyon structure. It's about 25 feet, 2,500 feet lower in elevation. It's a lot hotter than Lake Powell too. Now I want to talk about Lake Mead and Lake Powell volumes and how they've gone. Now this, I don't want to go into detail on this chart, but what you get out of this chart, which covers the years 1963 to today, this blue area is the volume of Lake Mead. The orange is Lake Powell. Collectively, their capacity is 50 million acre feet. In 1963, when Lake Powell came online, that's when you start seeing it fill. So this is Lake Powell filling. This is Lake Mead slowly, even filling in the 1960s and 70s. Until you got to the 80s, where both were essentially running full. And they reach about 25 million acre feet. That's Mead, that's Powell. You saw a dip in the late 80s to early 90s, and then they essentially refilled around 2000. But what you'll see, and I illustrate this on the next slide, this is the last 20 years, the right-hand part of that graph. This is since 1998, when the lakes were both about full. There was a huge drop in the early 2000s to about 2005, steady since then, up and down, and now another huge drop since 2020. And we're essentially, I don't want to call it a free fall, but we have been since 2020. And this is important because where the capacity is 50 million acre feet, today, the collective storage is about 13 million acre feet, roughly a quarter full. That has real ramifications, and it's shown on this graph here too. This is Lake Powell. I could do this for Mead, but I just want to illustrate one of the lakes. This is how the elevation when it's full. This is an important one, this purple line here. This is the minimum power pool, which is the elevation at which below you cannot generate power because you can't run the turbines of the dam. So whenever the lake is below that, you essentially get no energy, a big deal in the West. When you get down to the red line, that's called dead pool. And that means you can't run water through the dam at all. Essentially means water stops, doesn't get through because the outflows are not at ground, they're not at the base, they're high up on the lake. The base, by the way, is down here about 200 feet below dead pool. So that's where the river would have run naturally. Now, over the years, you can see this is essentially the same kind of graph, only illustrating lake levels, not volume. And now we're down here just above minimum power pool. We're running about 40 feet above minimum power pool right now. So if it goes down much more, and you can see in the last few years, it's gone down literally 100 feet, it goes down another 100 feet, you're not getting any power out of Lake Powell, that is Snake Glen Canyon Dam, nor are you getting it out of Lake Mead, which has the same story shown on this graph. This is Lake Mead, same dynamic. Here's the minimum power pools down here at 950, and we're up here about a little less than 100 feet above that. So both reservoirs are in jeopardy of not producing power. It's also difficult to maintain access, boating access. So recreation being a big deal on both reservoirs, big deal to the economies of the different states. This all comes into play as decisions are made on the future. Just very briefly, I want to show some changes over time in Lake Powell. This is where there's a 70-foot difference. This is called Bounds Canyon, about midway up the lake. This was 2 years ago. This is the exact same perspective just a month ago, looking down, and here you can see the lake extends up the canyon this way. Here's no more lake up this way. That's a 70-foot difference. Here's a 100-foot difference. This is in a place called the Rincon, also midway down the lake. This is this one is 2009, where the lake was 100 feet higher than today. And you can see this abandoned meander. This used to be the Colorado River coming around this giant butte. It's Navajo Mountain back there. And here it is today. This area, which is all covered with water in 2009, it was all high and dry. And now it's starting to look like the river it used to be. And here's a 170-foot difference. This is 1986 when the lake was full. This is up at the far northern end of the lake at a place called Height. It's called the Dirty Devil River. This is the Colorado River. The lake actually extended in those days another 15 miles beyond that point. This is today. The Colorado River has returned, and actually behind the photograph, the river continues for another 6 or 7 miles till you encounter the lake. So the lake has receded 40 or 50 miles. That's just the recession with a 170-foot drop. Here's another place. This is pretty. This is called Cathedral in the Desert. This is just 3 years ago, and the difference between just a short little waterfall and the lake extending into here, and here now about a 60 or 70-foot waterfall into a beautiful grotto. And it's arguable which is prettier, but it's definitely a change. This one I just want to show. This is my own lines marking different lake levels and where the lake would come to depending on the height. That's about an 80-foot difference. And I took photos over time to illustrate the differences, since I've pretty much been back there every year since the early 90s. It's obsessive, I agree. It also shows up in movies. So Planet of the Apes, not the cheesy remakes, but the original Planet of the Apes, which is worth watching, was filmed in part at Lake Powell. And this is the splashdown scene where they came out of outer space. This is called Gunsight Butte. And that was done at a lake level about 100 feet below the same photo in 2018, showing that over time, things do change. I'm just going to zip through here. This is a good one too. This is a shot right before the dam began to fill, essentially in a similar area when it was still a river. This is part of another movie called The Greatest Story Ever Told, which was filmed literally a month before Lake Powell began to fill. There's Charlton Heston freezing in December in the water. He's got a wetsuit on. He's not happy about that. You can see that. Here we go. This is going to be an important transition here. So I want to talk a little bit about, there I talked about what the lake's doing, and now I want to talk about why. And here's one reason. We've got a lot of growth in those states over the last 100 years. These graphs show it pretty well. I took 3 points in time, 1920, 100 years ago, 1950, and 2020. And what it's showing is pretty much tenfold growth in those 7 states. Now, remember that the original agreement was made in 1922 when there was only about 6 million people in those states. And now there's 60 million people in those states. And you can see California by far has the greatest population, but all of them have quite a bit of growth. And the one that really strikes me is Nevada. In 1920, the population of Nevada was less than the population of Greenville today. It had 77,000 people. Today it's got about 3 million. So every state has seen explosive growth. It's just a question of relative growth. Now, these states don't all count on the Colorado River equally. Arizona is the most reliant on the Colorado River. Anywhere from 30 to 40% of its entire water need comes from the Colorado River. So anything that happens to the Colorado River is going to have a big effect on Arizona. So if you are buying or have bought real estate in Phoenix or any of the big cities that have grown in Arizona, you should be a little bit worried about future water supply. It's a little less acute in the other states. Colorado and Utah rely on the Colorado River quite a bit. California, less so. California has a lot of different sources, both from the Sierra Nevada and other reservoirs and groundwater that the others don't. But an important consideration in moving forward. And here I want to show a little bit about what water has been used or is being used by the different states. And I simplified this just to show the lower basin states. Remember, California, Nevada, Arizona, that's that's the orange line. And then the upper basin states use the green line. That's Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming. And you'll see the lower basin states use more water. That was allowed under the law. And in general, over time, it's been anywhere between 6 and 8 million acre feet. And sometimes more than 8 million acre feet, which is more than they're allowed. And that was an issue back 20 years ago. Let's take this point in time, 2000. In 2000, the lower basin states were using way more than they were allowed to use. California and Arizona being the main culprits. And then we had a drought, a big drought in the early 2000s. And what that meant was rethinking water use, especially in the lower basin. And in fact, as a result, the lower basin did cut back their use quite a bit. And it's over time been using quite a bit less than they did before. Now they're below 7 million acre feet on average. The upper basin has slowly been creeping up over time and is a bit over 4 million acre feet. And that's based on what they think they can sustainably use. Is that true, though? Here I don't want to go through this graph in detail, but I do want to illustrate this. This red line across the top is how much water would need to be flowing down the Colorado River if both the lower basin got their entire allotments, and Mexico, who does get an allotment out of this. You need about 16.5 million acre feet. You see that hasn't happened very much. Hasn't happened often since 1971. and it hasn't happened at all since 2011. Now you can see another part of this. This is tricky. This green part is what the upper basin's actually using of that total. So whatever they don't use and whatever doesn't evaporate, that's this little orange thing, flows into Lake Powell. And that's this blue part. And you can see when there's less blue, you're not going to fill Lake Powell up much, which means you're not going to be able to deliver water farther downstream. That's what this shows right here. This colored part, anywhere you've got, this is a flow, net inflow into Lake Powell over that same period. And anywhere where it's below this orange line, in any year that happens, Lake Powell's going to go down. And you can argue, well, is the upper basin using too much? You could argue that. Is it also that maybe the protocol should be changed so the lower basin uses less? You could argue that. But in any case, since 2018, it's generally been going down. And you can see the periods where Lake Powell's been going, where the reservoirs go down. And that coincides when you hear news stories, which you're hearing now about finding bodies in Lake Mead. That always happens when the reservoirs go down. And that happened in the late 80s. You'll see National Geographic articles in the early 2000s. We're on the cusp of disaster. We're hearing it again today, and you're going to continue to hear that because the trend line is downward. This green line on this one paints the same kind of picture. What this is illustrates what the upper basin is required to deliver to the lower basin, and are they doing it? They're required to deliver 8.23 million acre feet. That's the lower basin share and Mexico's share that they're required to give. And have they been doing it? Well, yeah, they have. They don't have to do it every year. It just has to be an average, annual average, normalized over a rolling 10-year average. So if they don't make their average one year, they could make up for it the next year. But they have been delivering. In fact, they've been delivering way more than they've had to. In the late 80s, they were delivering well over 10 million acre feet. Even today, they're delivering over 8 million acre feet. So you can argue maybe they don't need to deliver as much, and maybe the lower basin can still get its share. I'm going to buzz through this one. It's showing the same story. I want to talk about where we are now, though. So here we are in a drought, and it's climate change induced, but it's also induced to some degree by water use. But one thing that is true, and I'll go back a couple of slides, there's a perception that water use just keeps going up and up and up and up because of population. It's actually not really true. Not about the Colorado River. The lower basin has found a way to use less over time. In California, that means conservation efforts they're excellent. It also means alternate sources of water, including desalination, reclaimed water, and just more efficient use. In the upper basin, it's gone up a bit, but not a whole lot. The collective use is about 11 million acre feet, nowhere close to the 15 in theory. And over time, you can see the trend line is more or less even. And so that's not the real problem. That's not why the reservoirs are going down so much. It really has to do with changes in climate or just drought in general. For those who are, skeptical of the concept that seems pretty self-evident, and I think everyone in the room, I think, understands that. It doesn't really matter why. There is not as much rain and snow. Let's talk about the drought in terms of numbers. And I like this kind of approach. I'm not an engineer. I just like thinking about trivia. That's what planners do, and that's what I am. So one of these things is, since in the last 50 years, 7 of the worst 10 snowpack years have occurred since 2001. So out of the last 50 years, 7 of the 10 worst are in the last 20. And snowpack in the Rockies is everything to the river system. In the last 80 years, or 90 years, 10 of the lowest 15 annual flows on the Colorado River have occurred since 2001. And of the other 5, only 2 happened before 1975. In other words, before 1975, flow is significantly higher in general. And that's accounting for the diversions and such that have occurred since then. Here, the number of times in the last 20 years prior to the compact in 1922, where the pre-diversion flow exceeded 17 million acre feet. That's a robust flow. Half the time it was something that they considered reasonable and what they expected. That robust flow has not happened at all, not once in the last 20 years, and it hasn't happened for 35 years. So that's where we're at in terms of flow. So you can see it's mostly driven by atmospheric phenomena, not by actual changes in use over time. Now, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation makes monthly projections about what's going to happen in the future, and they do it based in a lot on what forecasts are, climate forecasts. And this is the record of what's happened since 1964, what the average has been since 1991 in terms of flow in the Colorado, and what they expect to happen next year, these colorful ones in 2023. That's the worst case scenario, that's the likely scenario, that's the best case scenario. And you can see even the likely scenario is below average. You can see in 2022, below average, 2021, way below average. In general, over the last 15 years, below average. And you can see here where that's going. They also project where that means in terms of lake levels. And their worst case scenario, or the minimum likely scenario, that's this red line, projecting into next year, you hit this point in November 2023. That's the minimum power pool of Lake Powell, of Glen Canyon Dam. So if we don't get a change in how we deal with managing the river, and we don't get much snow this coming winter, this is a scenario we could see next fall, where you don't generate power. Now, there are things that can be done. And the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation called for action this last June. And it was in the news, it was a big deal. In June, they laid down the gauntlet to the states. They said, look, you all have to cut back on your use by 2 to 4 million acre feet. That's roughly a 30% cut in your use from this source, or else we're going to have a real problem. And you have 60 days to come up with a plan to do that. Now, having those 7 states agree on anything is an impossibility. And it's politically, they're very different from one another, but not just that, their interests are different than one another. They have their own needs, and no state is going to willingly give up a right, negotiate it away, unless, no one's going to lead with that. It will take an outside entity for that to occur. And that's what the Bureau of Reclamation essentially was saying. If you guys can't figure it out, we'll figure it out for you. And then if they do, I can see there'd be a legal clash there. But that's the idea. So 60 days came and went, no action by the states. Some of the states actually put out ideas, all in their own self-interest. The upper basin states said, well, we've given it the office, the lower basin has to make all the cuts. California said, hey, we're already below what we've been doing. I don't know, maybe we shouldn't have to do that. So now it's back in the ballpark of the Bureau of Reclamation. And they threatened to make threats. They haven't done anything yet. Here we are in October, 2 months after the deadline. So this is a very topical thing. And as I say, if things don't change, we may not be seeing power generated through Glen Canyon Dam at the end of next year. So let's talk about solutions. And what are some clues? What do we know? Well, these are important considerations. About 80% of the water on the Colorado River is actually used for agriculture, not municipal use. That varies state to state, but more or less true. So the most bang for your buck is changes in agricultural practices, potentially. The Imperial Irrigation District, I could talk about this one for a while. They're a unique entity in the entire system. They hold 75% of California's share of the water. They hold a larger share of the water than any of the other states individually. So what they do is going to make a big difference in terms of how the system goes. And what do they do with the water? The Imperial Irrigation District is in the far southeastern corner of California. Hot desert. Imperial County is the center near the Mexican border. If you know the Salton Sea, it's that area. And they grow a lot of alfalfa and lettuce. And a lot of the alfalfa is used as cattle feed. Some of it exported to other states or even overseas. The lettuce is eaten, it's sold all over the country, although it's only one of 2 major lettuce growing areas in California, the other being Monterey County and the Central Coast, near where I live. And in fact, if you lost the Imperial Valley's lettuce, you'd still have a lot of lettuce coming out of California. So the question is, can that water be used better? Now, they also happen to hold the senior right of water of anybody in the entire system. The reason Hoover Dam exists, the reason this whole thing started, was in large part an impetus from the Imperial Irrigation District, which was founded in 1911. So that's a big elephant in the room in a solution. There's other considerations. The Colorado Front Range cities, meaning Denver, Boulder, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, they get a lot of their water from the Colorado River, but they're not in the Colorado River watershed. It's actually pumped through pipes and down the Front Range into what's really the Missouri-Mississippi watershed. And so any water that goes there is lost to the system. Any return flow doesn't go to the Colorado River, it goes elsewhere. So that's a consideration. About 500,000 acre feet goes in that direction. In LA, the Metropolitan Water District, who uses a lot of water, they use probably close to 1.5 million acre feet of water in the Colorado. They are the other major user besides the Imperial Irrigation District. They're exploring a lot of desalination plants and reclaimed water plants to offset some of their use. And they also have access to water from elsewhere in the state. So they're in a little better position to help themselves. Reclaimed water, meaning a wastewater treatment plant that you go in there and treat it and drink it. That's becoming a reality in the West. The regulations are moving in that direction. And if that happens, that's a found source of water that's never been used before. It's used to irrigate crops, or not crops so much, but landscaping extensively. And that's part of the solution. And some states have poor water conservation practices, more poor than others. You know, in the East, it's not critical when there's a lot of water, but in the West, it's critical. California has excellent conservation practices in terms of low flow plumbing, drought tolerant landscaping and such. Colorado and others, they also do that. But on a state level, some of the states don't do as good a job as others. And if they all brought their standards up a bit, that's another source of found water and a solution. So back to the beginning, the challenge, where I said there's going to be a renegotiation of this 1922 pact. There's also going to be a way for the states to come together and rethink their current crisis. So there are a lot of interest groups that make this difficult. There's the Bureau of Reclamation. Their interest is water and power. They want to maintain flow through the dams and be able to make that happen. Each state has its own individual interests, their cities, their agriculture, and so forth. So rights. Native American tribes, who were left out of the original agreement, many of these tribes do have rights backdoored through the state rights, but they are a new player at the table in a renegotiation. And then there's public interests who don't have it, they're not states. There's some environmental groups, generally smaller ones, who want to see Lake Powell drained and a return of the habitat. And of course that, I would say on that front, if there had never been a Glen Canyon Dam, I would say it would be nice not to have that, but we do have a Glen Canyon Dam there. By that meaning, there's a whole lot of people who rely on it for a lot of reasons. And that's what probably more people feel in general. I'm trying to be objective about this, but I think that's true. Most others want to restore a semblance of stability to Lake Powell and Lake Mead because of the importance in terms of water power, recreation, meaning the economy, and flood control, and very important for a lot of reasons. And so getting involved. Now, how did I get involved in this? Well, for me, I sort of said at the beginning, I'm an environmental planner. I love the region. I go there a lot. I like Lake Powell. I'm into Western water issues. How could I not get involved? And so one of the things that I decided I'd do, and anybody can do this because the data is all that out there, is put together a plan about what could be done about this. And so I did with some input from others. And I've sent editorials and letters to newspapers. Occasionally they get published. And along with a few other folks have reached out to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation through a group that actually their big deal, the Blue Ribbon Coalition, is to maintain public access to public lands. But they're also politically connected. It's hard to get any action unless you know people who can actually do something. So that's an avenue of political connections. And of course, it's going to take some pretty weird politics for things to change because you've got both very conservative, very liberal governments within the 7 Western states. But in any case, if you are looking for any kind of real solution, you got to get involved. I want to talk very briefly and tell me where I am on time. Okay, getting there, getting close. So this is I just want to show some snapshots within the plan that I helped put together, I'll say primarily put together, and has since been distributed to different entities, senators, representatives. The idea is to help influence an outcome. The Bureau of Reclamation is aware of this. They had a public outreach forum about a month ago. They acknowledged some people had sent 2,000 copies of this plan. So whether or not it's the plan, the idea to get ideas out there is very important. In this case, I think I've thought through a lot of things, but this is where public input, and I'd love to hear some ideas from this forum here. The idea for me to make things work, these are the principles. You got to have sustainable water and power, whatever we do in terms of water. we have to act now. There's no waiting. Next year could be a crisis. Water use reductions between the states have to be fair and equitable. And it can't be, no, California's got to do it all, or Colorado's can't work. You're never going to get an agreement that way. And you can't save one reservoir at the expense of another. There's a group out there that says, we got to fill Lake Mead and let Lake Powell run free. Well, it's not going to work. It doesn't work because you cannot make the system work because of the geography of the two reservoirs and where the states are located. And finally, you got to be flexible. If the rain comes back, well, then we could reduce the restrictions. And if the snow never returns, then we have a real problem, but we all have to share that pain. So the plan, as I'm thinking about it, is pretty simple, and it's based on, and any plan's got to be simple to work. It's just two controllable variables. You've got the water use in each state and the water releases through Glen Canyon Dam. So if we can control water use in each state and have an agreement there, and then the US Bureau of Reclamation can release water in a way that balances the reservoirs and makes it possible for that to happen, it could work. But all that is tied to the second part here. It's tied to the lake level, and the amount that those would be, numbers don't matter right now, would be based on what is true on September 30. That's the end of the water year. They define the water year as October 1 to September 30 for a variety of reasons, but it has to do with the seasonal flow. And of course, all that depends on the one uncontrollable variable, and that's the precipitation and the snowpack. And that's everything. And we know that trend is heading downward. So in the plan that I developed, you have to think about what's the baseline? What's the baseline of where we think is fair and equitable? And I looked through the entire record back to 1900. And it turns out 2016 to 20 isn't a bad baseline, because what's true about that doesn't matter that it wasn't the highest flow rate or anything like that. But in those years, the reservoirs were pretty stable in volume. Water use among the states was pretty stable year to year. And inflow to Lake Powell was pretty stable too, but it was lower than in the 30-year average, meaning conservative. If we're going to think about a baseline, we got to think conservatively and not overthink the flows as was done 100 years ago. I'm not going to go through these tables. I just want to show my thinking right here. The 2016 to 2020 average of these different factors. How much water is available to the system? The inflow below Glen Canyon Dam. The use in the upper and lower basin. And the evaporation in the upper and lower basin. Those are known things. And anything I'm talking about here isn't model. I'm not a modeler. I'm just taking the data and I'm analyzing it and putting it together. This is measurable stuff. Key elevations, these are known. These are important. So what's the full pool? What's the level at which recreation uses are impaired? What is the level at which we can generate power, and at what level can we not send water through the dams? And then if you know that information and you know a reduction from the baseline for each state that might be necessary based on how low the water is, how much snow is coming in, you can actually do the math, figure out how much the lower and upper basin could use at a 30% reduction, and then it pencils out. And then and over here on the right side, when do you apply that? It's when Lake Powell is low, when Lake Mead is low, that's when you have the biggest reductions. And then down here at the bottom of the table, you don't have to do a reduction when Lake Mead is high and Lake Powell is high. So there's measurable outcomes that you're trying to come to. And this is just doing the same thing, but parsing it out by state. So you can see each state's requirement over time as the lakes go up and down to make this work. And this is the other side of it. That's the water use side. This is the release side for the Bureau of Reclamation. Now, the rolling 10-year average that needs to be sent through Glen Canyon Dam is 8.23 million acre feet right now. But if you use less water in the lower basin, maybe you don't need to send down as much. So this is a variable scale about how much water would have to be sent down through Glen Canyon Dam. And as the lakes are lower, you send down less. Everyone shares the pain. Everyone's using less, but it keeps the reservoirs up for the future for all those purposes, for power, for water, for recreation. Now, here we're talking about, this is a summary of that. So the water reductions for each state will be based on lake levels at the end of a given water year, based on the baseline. The changes in what the Bureau of Reclamation would release is based on same baseline and the lake levels. And ultimately, it's flexible. The plan would be flexible. If the snow comes back for 5 years and we fill the lakes, you don't need reductions anymore. Now here I wanted to flip over to A really cool thing that I want to show you. Let's see if I could, if I'm technologically impaired a little bit. I'm not Tom. Okay. Now this is a dashboard in Tableau put together by Anna Galaeva, who I worked with on this a little bit. She put together, she works at Microsoft. She's a data engineer and a BI solutions architect, meaning business intelligence. And the idea is what she's good at is taking gobbledygook data and turning it into something practical that you can see and use and apply. And this is a really cool thing. This is taking all the data that I had and showing what could happen under these different scenarios, depending on the lake levels and such. This is just Lake Powell, different outcomes. And I just want to show these few lines. This purple line across the top is Lake Powell and it's full, 3,700 feet. That's going to be static in the different screens I show you. This greenish line that's the lake level at 3588, where you have unimpaired boat access. In other words, full use of the lake economically, recreationally. This yellow line is the minimum power pool, 3490, at which you can't generate electricity, and that's revenue too. And this red line is dead pool, where you can't get water to go through the dam to get down to the Grand Canyon, and that's a real problem. Now, this variable blue line here is the actual water level projecting into the future. This is 2022, 2027. And where I've got it set right now is when you have average flow to the system, as we saw from 2016 to 20, and we don't do anything different, just consume the way we've been consuming. What happens? Well, if you have average, actually the lake's going to go up. It's going to go up. Here we are at 3530, but over time by 2024, we're going to be up here closer to over 3,600. And you're going to say, well, great, we don't have to do anything because all we got to do is get average flow. Problem is we haven't had average flow consistently for a long time. And in the last 4 years, it's been something like 40% below average. So what happens then if we have less than average flow over the next 5 years? I'm going to go to 20% less than average flow and watch that blue line at the top. It just went backwards. So here we are today at 3530, but if we have 20% less than average consistently over time, it's going to finally hit minimum power pool in late 2024 and just keep on going down. Now, I'm making the assumption that every year is the same. That won't be the case, but this is sort of normalizing below average years over the next 5 years. This light blue line at the bottom, by the way, is the protocol for releases that the Bureau of Reclamation would have to do under the plan that I've come up with here. Now, what happens with a real catastrophic flow, 40% below average? Well, you hit dead pool by 2025. So we can't have that. So what I've tried to do here is then show, well, what happens if here I'm going to hit the Act Now button, and that is put in the conservation efforts and implement less use in the upper and lower basin. Suddenly, even with 40% less flow than average, you got at least sustainable water level in Lake Powell. It requires the cuts that I was talking about here. And in fact, but at least you are able to generate power and some recreation. And if we have even average flow and people do the conservation efforts, well, then you have a seriously good, sustainable water supply within Lake Powell. Now, I could go through this a little bit more, and I really don't have time to do that because I'd like to get to some questions. But the point is, this is a really great tool, and tools like this are very useful in terms of implementing a plan or at least showing what could happen over time. So I want to thank Anna for that. It's really good. Now I want to go back to the end of the presentation here. Is it this one here? What's up? Oh, here, Tom. Right here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so, how did we lose that? Okay, so I'm going to cut right here to the end. So at the end here, what we need to do is see a 30% reduction soon, just as the Bureau of Reclamation said. And if we can do that, then we're in a position to keep the system working. And I say the system, meaning all the parts of it, and for all the purposes that I had said before. Now, and I'll leave it with this challenge. So the key challenge will be, how will the states offset use from the Colorado River in the long term? How are they going to be done? We need to find new supplies. cut demand or do both. Some states are in a better position to do both, California being one of them because they're on a coast. But that's the reality in front of everybody. And it'll take time. But the point of a plan right now is we could have really bad years of precipitation, but a plan will buy some time to allow for that to happen where the water regime of the states changes. And here with climate change and population growth, that's the reality that we all face. And so with that, I just want to say thank you. Really appreciate your time. And this was essentially what I would think is a 10-week course compressed into 1 hour. So there's a lot to cover here, and I'd be glad to answer anybody's questions and go from there. So thank you.
Okay, I know we're over time here. We're at about 4:30, but I do want to leave just a few minutes for questions. Let's start in the room. Scott, go ahead.
I have two questions. First, is any of Colorado River water being supplied to the Salt Lake City? Second, what are the ramifications of going below the power generation level in Lake Powell? Power being water up project to get the thing.
So the question, if it wasn't legible or audible here, was what is the ramification? Is the Salt Lake City area using water? Are they using water from the system? The short answer to that is yes. So there is some water that's being used in Utah, and that's primary. Their total use is on the order of, I want to say, 1 million acre feet or something like that. The collective upper basin use, that's Colorado, Utah, is about 4 million acre feet. Colorado uses most of that, and it's all diverted before it gets to Lake Powell. So it's not upstream flow from Lake Powell. So the only actual user of Lake Powell water is the city of Page, Arizona. Beyond that, it's all flowing down through the dam. So then you asked the other question, which was?
What happens if you can't generate any power in Lake Powell?
So what happens if you can't generate power through Lake Powell? The Western power grid, I'm going to make this number up. That's an important source of power, but it's not 50%. It's something like 5 or 10% of the Western power grid. But if you have that kind of hit, it means a big deal in Southern California and Arizona and Nevada, which is the real recipient of a lot of that power. How that's offset, that's a long discussion here. Yeah. Any other questions?
Maybe my question is little basic. Can you imagine the share water?
Sure. So the question is, how do these states, in a basic sense, share the water, or how did they share the water before there were any dams? A great question, and it's a relevant question even now. You know, if you're the upper basin states, you know what you're allowed, what you're required to deliver to the lower basin. But what you can actually use is sort of a crapshoot. You don't know, you think you can use this much, but you don't know what the snowpack this year is going to be. So you really don't know what the flow is going to be. So you're sort of planning ahead and guessing. And they've been guessing sort of right, but you can see over time, if Lake Powell goes down, it basically means upper basin is using more than is sustainable. It also means maybe the lower basin should be using less too, but that's a legal question. Before there was a Glen Canyon Dam, that regulatory device to send water downstream didn't exist. So it all flowed to Hoover Dam at that point. And California was the beneficiary. They used way more than their share up until the 1980s, pretty much. So yeah, it's hard to monitor who's using what, and it's a difficult thing. But retrospectively, you can see what people use and say, oh, we should have done this. But it's a hard question for sure.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to go to the chat really quick, not the chat, but to the people online. If anybody has a question, please go ahead and just shout out your question. I'm going to unmute everybody. Well, if you want to shout out a question online, go ahead and unmute yourself and shout it out, and then we'll wrap it up in just a minute.
I'll go ahead and jump at this opportunity. First, thanks for the presentation. This is very highly relevant and important subject. I had more of a comment really, which is, in the framing of this, it's really important to remember that Mexico has a really integral part in this basin negotiation as well with their 1.5 million acre feet, and they need to be part of any negotiated solution. And secondly, as well as the tribes, I think it's really given that they didn't have a seat at the table at the beginning. I certainly agree with the basic premise that proportionally, like having flexible allocations based on what the flow looks like, I think is what they're going to have to do, as well as reimagining what the use of some of these consumptive uses look like in the basin. So I just wanted to leave it at that, but thank you. Appreciate the talk.
Great comment. And Mexico is a big player, and I didn't really emphasize that much, but they have a right to 1.5 million acre feet, which was not considered in 1922, but came about 20 years later. But yes, great point.
So we are way over time. Unless there's another,
Question in the back.
go ahead. One more question.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you staying as long as you have. It's really great.
So, as the water impact of biodiversity.
Have I noticed any impacts on the environment as a result? So the question is, as the water levels have been dropping, have we noticed any impacts on the environment? And the answer is yes, all over, lots of things. That's a whole discussion, from heavy siltation at the heads of the rivers and the lakes, changing habitat there, the fact that you've got possibly more dust entrained as a result. You've changed the some of the impacts related to biology, the general what you'd expect in terms of in the lakes. Over time, there's been all kinds of, because of the dams, you had a big environmental impact. It changed the temperature and the siltation regime, which changed fisheries. And because lower lake levels, if you want to expand the concept of environment to mean people, traffic, access, recreation, huge impacts. But yes, and it's a dynamic system. So stability is a really important thing in terms of being able to predict the future for planning. So that's what we are hoping to be, but certainly environmental impacts are a big deal.
Okay, since we are at 4:36, we're way over time. We want to make sure we get to Pitt Street before it fills up with people. And
That's an
so
important thing.
I first want to thank everybody that joined us online. I will mention that if the technology worked out right, we will have this session recorded, and I will make that recording available to people that would like to have that. And I really want to thank everybody that's here with us in person. It's great for me personally to be here, to see everybody together, and I'm sure it's good for you guys too, but particularly for me, to have my brother here is a big deal. So I want to thank you, and we are going to reconvene at Pitt Street as soon as we can get there. And thanks again.
And thank you.